Okay, Jasey Anderson is in Revelstoke.
Woo!
World Cup and Olympic champion. Hello, Jasey. Welcome to Revelstoke. Good to see you.
What's up, bud?
So we promised people we would answer questions. Here we go. Starting with Mickey wants to know, when Ben Carl ditched Kessler's Titanal boards for Virus's Xylon construction boards,
Spicy.
Ben Carl ditched Kessler's Titanal boards for Virus's Xylon construction boards, then boom, Olympic gold and the crystal globe. Lots of World Cup racers are now doing the same. So, is Titanal construction outdated?
It is not. This is a spicy question, and there could be a very long answer to this. I'll try to keep it short. There are two categories, I guess, of matrix materials that you would use in a snowboard. And Xylon would fit in the fibers category. So fiberglass, carbon fiber, Kevlar, Xylon, they're all fibers. And then you have metals like titanol. Actually, it's one of the only metals that I know of that you can use properly in skis or snowboards. In the ski industry, they've used, let's say, stainless steel and other materials, but for snowboards, that doesn't work. The wider you go, the less you can use metals. Metals are actually, we'll stick to titanol. Titanol is actually a slow material, if you can believe it or not. Fibers are faster than metals, except depends on conditions, the pitch you're going to use, what else is involved. Xylon is probably okay. I haven't tested enough with it yet, but I have tested, and it's nothing special. It's good. It's definitely good. It's better than fiberglass in general, but you can't just use Xylon. You're always going to mix it with other things. You can't just use carbon. And the difference is titanol is very damp. So when you put it on hard snow, it works to dampen the vibrations that hard snow would give you. And it gives you better bite. Fibers are more directional. So you could have, let's say, a uni, a biax, a triax. Triaxial is what all snowboards are made of usually. Regular shop or online snowboards, mass-produced snowboards are made with triax in general and a little bit of carbon sometimes. So fibers are faster because they're more resilient. They are not that damp, except for Kevlar. Xylon is a little bit in between, and titanol is damp. So if that answers your question, I'm happy, but it is a deep subject. In the end, fibers are fast, metals are slow, or titanol is slow, but it depends what condition you're going to use it in, and titanol is not going away at all. Titanol is at the moment the best material, generally speaking, for any carving. So Xylon might have won a few races, and it will continue to evolve and win races, but titanol will remain for a long time the material of reference.
Great. Next question. Russ Britt from Idaho wants to know, what radius puts the most G-forces on the legs during a turn? A long radius or a short radius?
These questions are amazing. It is ambiguous, actually, because let's say you're riding green runs, a long side cut just won't perform on green runs. So you're going to want a shorter side cut. On steeper black diamonds, you're going to want a longer side cut because a short side cut has more tendency to chatter. So the blue run is the gray zone where we don't know. Let's say you could do both. It just depends what you prefer. But generally speaking, for chatter, a longer side cut is better. A shorter side cut is worse. And then you have the flex that can actually come in and completely destroy any of this. So if you have a softer construction, a softer flex, that could go well with a longer side cut if you wanted to ride easier. So it depends how challenging you want your equipment. But if you go softer with more radius that caters, let's say, to more green runs, stiffer, longer radius, black diamonds. Best I can give you right now.
So Russ is actually a friend of mine, and I happen to know he has one good leg and one bad leg. So I suspect the context of this question is he's maybe trying to ride a carving board that reduces the G-forces so he can favor that one good leg more.
That's a bit of a contradiction because alpine snowboarding is about, not alpine, carving snowboarding, including alpine snowboarding, is all about G-forces. It's either what we're looking for or it gives the best result, which is angulation. So if you're looking for easier rides, I guess you'd be wanting to reduce the G-forces, which in the end, it depends how much angulation you want, because usually angulation equals G-force. And I would recommend something in between. So in carving, a long side cut would be more like a 15-meter side cut, and a short side cut, you'd be all the way down to maybe an 8-meter side cut. So the difference between 15 and 8, you could split the difference and just go for like an 11 or 12-meter side cut for blue runs, and that would give you enough side cut to get your angulation, but not too much for G-forces.
Thanks. From Felix, comes from the forum at carversconnection.com. Felix wants to know, what's your take, Jasey, on the lack of directional asymmetrical boards in the production board segment now that carving is starting to regain popularity?
That's an awesome question. Like, asymmetrical's been around almost since the beginning of snowboarding. Pretty much once they figured out that toe side and heel side were dynamically different, and that you could make snowboards that could cater to each side, then it was Pandora's box, because you can get asymmetry through flex patterns. So the construction could be asymmetrical. You can offset your side cuts one to the other. You can have different side cuts. You can have progressive side cuts that are different also, that are asymmetrical. So the asymmetry, in a way, is endless. You could have a board that completely looks symmetrical, but because the side cut radiuses are different, they become asymmetrical. And what the industry's tried to do, over-the-counter snowboards, is try to make a twin tip so it's not a goofy irregular. You can use it both ways, which has its purpose. But the more you're trying to push it to cater to what you want to do, then you kind of need to go into that custom build and ask your builder to make the different side cuts so that it's directional. I actually don't see a future for it in snowboarding, because it goes to let's say the second or third level of snowboarding, where the first one, you just need a snowboard to snowboard around, and it's usually intermediate riders. When you get into the advanced market, there's a lot less market share. And then if you have to split it into goofy and regular for a small market share, it doesn't make sense. Burton tried it back in the day, and they had moderate success with it, but they didn't continue because of the complexity. And again, because there's so many options for asymmetry, that where do you begin? Which caters to what you do? It really is going to fall into the hands of the custom builders, I think.
Yeah, seems about right. One more question from Felix here. Do you think more soft boot snowboarders should try hard booting?
Yeah, hard booting is what I did my whole life. I did everything, actually. I don't discriminate. I ski also. I rode half pipe when I was a kid. I did moguls. I raced border cross for 10 years. I cross country ski. I do everything. And I love just sport in general. So if we go back to just alpine snowboarding, it was a passion for me, partly because of the G's. I just like carving. And it's pretty hard to make a living as a free ride carver, especially back in the day. And racing was fun. You could train it, you could really focus on it. And teams like the Burton team was, back in the day, the team to be on. So it was something to strive to. And it's evolved quite a bit. It has spurts. Alpine snowboarding has spurts. And if you just look at alpine snowboarding for free carving, I'm not sure I would recommend anybody try it unless they're really motivated by what they see. It's a little bit like trying to push your kid into a sport. I find passion and drive is what actually should guide people to a sport, not necessarily always suggesting it like a marketing scheme. So hard booting, I find, has to be something you want to do, not necessarily that you're marketed to do. And the difference between soft boot carving and alpine snowboarding is huge, because alpine snowboarding, the setup itself is quite complex, and you really need to be passionate about it if you're going to sell it in a store. Because like in skiing, you can just slap bindings on skis and it works. Alpine snowboards, it doesn't work like that. And it's the same thing for soft boots. You can just put bindings on a board, goofy or regular, that's it. Maybe angles a little bit. But in alpine snowboarding, your stance width is huge. Your canting, so I actually never used canting in alpine snowboarding, nor do I recommend it. You would need a special circumstance for canting, but toe lift, heel lift is imperative. You need it for alpine snowboarding, especially heel lift. So when you're looking at angles, lift, and canting or not to cant, stance width, and then the type of board you're going to use, there's just too many options, too many variables for alpine snowboarding. It's really hard to initiate someone into alpine snowboarding. You got to be passionate to get into it.
Good answer. Pat Latenki from YouTube wants to know, is there a minimum and maximum splay? In other words, the difference between your binding angles. So if you had parallel angles, you'd be at 0 splay. If you had, let's say, -15 plus 15 duck, that would be a 30-degree splay. Is there a minimum and a maximum?
We'll focus on the carving side of this question. I always used a maximum of 9 degrees between my front and back foot. And it just has to do with, I guess, how your hips are going to work and how your knees are going to work in the turn. And everyone has their preferences. It also has to do with board width. So the wider the board, you can go with less angles. But if you want better hip movement, you go with more angles. And that's where the difference between your front and back foot, in my world, was about a maximum of 9 degrees. Anytime I went over that, there was a discomfort and an adjustment, and sometimes even like stress and injury. So when you're looking at, let's say, duck stance, that's a whole different ball game, and that really caters to someone that's going to ride both ways. Because ergonomically, there's no positive to being duck stance. It's actually only negative unless you're riding equally switch or goofy or regular, or you're spending your time spinning or going backwards or forwards. That's really what duck stance is meant for. But if you're just carving around, you definitely have to go posi-posi. There's no argument there. Posi-posi is ergonomically healthier than having a duck stance, and you can position your hips in better ways to have more power against the board, more leverage against the board, more predictability. So duck stance, it works if you're stuck in duck stance, but you don't actually purposely carve with a duck stance.
So as a little side question there, what is your preferred stance for soft boot carving?
I move around a lot for soft boot carving. It depends what I'm doing, how soft the snow is, how steep the runs are. But generally, and it also your boots. So if you have really stiff boots, you can go with quite stiff angles, but you got to shim the schnitzels out of them. You need tongue stiffeners, lateral stiffeners. You got to just beef them up to have steep angles to get the performance out of it. And so at lower angles, that's when you can use definitely softer equipment, which is readily available. depending on what I'm using, that's what's going to determine the stance and exactly what else am I going to do, because it's pretty rare you're just going to go out to carve.
Not for me.
Usually it's good. He's a liar. I've seen it. Usually it's good for 2 hours, and then he leaves. Whether it's if I'm going to stay at the hill and I don't have a screwdriver or want to move my stance around, that's when I'm going to drop it down. Because if I'm playing in the woods or if I'm going to ride powder or do different things like that, I want a little lower angles. And if I'm just carving, I do go higher, and then I just shim the schnitzels out of my boots.
Related question from Ntalk68. Thoughts on stance, high back lean, and binding angles in soft boots, and presumably for softwood carving?
Yeah, it's a tough short answer to all the stance, high back lean, binding angles. I just kind of described it in my last question, so this would be a bit of a follow-up question to what angles do. And like I just described, stiffer equipment, you can go with higher angles. Softer equipment, lower angles. That's pretty much what it comes down to. The high back lean has to do with comfort. So, and your board. Your board is huge on this. If your board can handle more leverage, then you can go with steeper high back angles. If your board is a softer board or too stiff sometimes, if you have a lot of binding, high back angle, it could affect it negatively in a lot of ways. The most complicated one is the high back angle, because generally speaking, you want a lot for carving. It just means you get more leverage against the board. But if the board can't handle it, you can't do that. So it's a bit of a trick question here. It has to do with the board a lot. And then your stance, that's pretty optional. Usually, stance width has to do with leg length. If you have long legs, you go wider. You have short legs, you go in more. That's it.
I realize this is an Ask Jasey video, but if I can just interject a couple of things. I think it's also pretty safe to say the more duck-footed stance you are, you don't need any toe or heel lift, but a little bit of canting is good. But the steeper angles you go, that's when you want the heel lift in the back foot and the toe lift in the front foot. Oh yeah, and for forward lean, there's always going to be a trade-off. If you crank down your forward lean really far, your heel edge is going to engage really quickly, but your toe edge is going to be slow. And if you bring it all the way up, well, then your heel edge is going to be really slow, but your toe edge is going to be really quick. So there's always going to be a trade-off. You got to find that comfort zone that works for you. Antox from Antox68 also wants to know, what are your thoughts on rotation versus counter rotation of the upper body in toe side turns?
I don't really work on rotation, to be honest. A little bit, but usually not. Rotation in my world is secondary. The most important thing I work on generally is board pressure or edge pressure. If you're focused on that, then the rotation just happens gradually, because board pressure happens first and then you rotate through the turn. Again, I work on hips, not necessarily shoulders. So if the hips are rotating through the turn, so board pressure, hips rotating through the turn, shoulders should always follow what the hips are doing to a certain extent. James and I have different ways of looking at this, but I come at it from more of a racer background. He comes at it more from a, let's say, aesthetics background, which he tries to keep it nice and tight. And for me, I try to use counterweight. So if I'm going to rotate through a turn, I don't want my hands to both be on the same side. I actually want counterweight with another hand back here, toe side and heel side. And then I drive it in to transition the other arm. So toe side would look more something like this, and a heel side would look more something like this. So the rotation actually through the turn with either upper body or, I guess, hips happens automatically. The only time I do touch on it is when people are too robotic. Then you can start working on rotation, but board pressure is definitely number one by far. You need that board pressure before you even discuss rotation.
So, Jasey, next question. When and why did you get into building boards?
I got into building boards simply because I like pushing the possibilities of what a snowboard can do. And everyone that builds snowboards and it becomes their livelihood, you have to just, the best way to make money is to reproduce the same thing. So as a custom board builder, you're doing one-offs all the time, which is fun because you learn a lot and you do different things. But as a builder, it's very, how should I say, inefficient and not lucrative. So you're lucky if it's viable, but you'll probably never be lucrative. People that have had success kind of crossing both worlds are like Oxess and Kessler. They're in the let's say, Kessler and Oxess are in the biggest market in the world, which is Europe. So as North Americans, very few are going to have success in the high level custom market. But the reason I got into it was because I like pushing the envelope. So by doing custom boards, that's where you learn the most. You get to have direct contact with your clients. And to me, it was never good enough. The closest I got actually to doing real development was with Bruce at Coiler. So I worked with Bruce for 4 years. And I worked with Kessler a little bit, but Kessler was really closed. So the development was really slow and inefficient. I got what I needed in the end, but it was definitely painful. And I can't blame him. Kessler has a lot of knowledge and he just doesn't want to give it. Whether as with Bruce, we were sharing knowledge and we were both trying to improve everything as fast as possible. And that's where I learned the most was with Bruce. I was with Burton Snowboards for 9 years as a pro, and that's where I learned the least, unfortunately. Burton doesn't do much development back in my day. Today could be a different thing, but these big companies, they just try to manufacture so they make a good profit. It's not necessarily to learn or to have the essence of snowboarding. It has nothing to do with that. The small builders, they're there to find the essence of snowboarding and push the envelope. They are the developers, and I wanted to be part of that.
Great, thanks, good answer. Next question. What is your favorite type of riding?
I think the holy grail would be just riding endless powder fields. Although I'm a carver, it was the closest thing I could get to any type of surfing, riding powder. We just don't have it out east in Quebec. It happens once in a blue moon, and if it does happen, it's tracked out within an hour. So it's basically non-existent. So that's why I ended up racing. Even when I started, we didn't have half pipes or slope style. I did freestyle, but I got my pass cut and, probably a dozen times because I had a little jump in the corner of the resort somewhere. Some ski patrol came in and destroyed it and took my pass. So I just got into racing and loved it, I don't discriminate. I ski, I cross-country ski, I ski tour. Believe it or not, I've never split boarded. But I carve, I did half-pipe events. I've podiumed in half-pipe events. I've podiumed in big airs. So I've done a lot of competition. I border crossed again for 10 years of my life with great success. And I loved each discipline. I do not discriminate. But the holy grail in my world is powder riding.
Yeah. Nobody can argue with that. I remember that back in the day in the 80s and 90s in Quebec. You took a jump, they would cut your pass. So what else are you going to do? You're going to learn to carve.
Yeah, exactly. And if it's fun, you're going to stick with it.
Oh, yeah. And last question here, I think, for tonight from Martina C. The question comes here from YouTube. Where would you like to take the families on a snowboard vacation?
Well, I'm at James's here. And for anyone who wants to stay here, he invites everybody. Anyone can come and stay at James's. He loves guests. No, I'm just kidding. I'm a slave. I'm doing his dishes. I'm cooking for him. I'm vacuuming, even babysitting. I'm doing everything here. Do not come to James's. It's hard work. But this would be, Revelstoke is a good place to carve. It's a good place to ride a bit of powder if you're lucky. It's just a beautiful, magical scenery. Revelstoke was a bit of my dream spot. So I'm here visiting James.
Evelyn has a question for you too. Come on.
Great question, Evelyn. Yeah, kids are fun. I had them, and now they're 18 and 19, and you know, ripping snowboards, sometimes skiing. I try to get them exposed to everything.
You have a question?
What's your other question?
What's for dinner?
Oh boy. What we're having for dinner is last night's leftovers. We're
Again?
recycling. Yeah, again. Leftovers for 4 nights now.
Okay, thanks, Jasey. Thanks for showing up. Thanks for taking questions. Looking forward to riding again tomorrow.
Thanks for having me.
Anytime, anytime.
On the forum and in your house.
Wicked. Thanks for watching. We'll try to post something again in a few days. And we're out.
He told me to ask you what's for dinner.
Good question.
Okay, sorry to bug you, Jasey. I see you working on your boots there, but we got a couple more questions came in last minute. From Riot Supercarver, what principles underpin your use of binding lift and cant for hard boots and for soft boots?
All ergonomics. So if you're perfectly sideways on a snowboard, you're looking at cant. As your feet pull apart like this, you can picture the Vitruvian Man, I believe it was called, by Leonardo da Vinci. But as you go wider apart, you have to cant your boots. And then if you were to move sideways like this and move your feet apart more like, let's say, alpine, then you're looking purely at lift. So your heel lifts up and your toe lifts up. So if you do somewhere in between at 45 degrees, theoretically, especially on a snowboard, on an alpine snowboard, since your feet are so close, you're more looking at lifting your toes, lifting your heel. And then as you close in, again, you're looking at more canting. So a freestyle setup or a soft boot setup would be a little bit more canting, and a hard boot setup would be more lift. And how much kind of depends on your stance also. So again, further your feet are apart, the more cant you're going to need. And let's say more angle you have, more lift you're going to need, which is again more alpine. So if you like a wider stance on your soft boot setup, then you're definitely going to want to look at canting. And if you're going to want a wider stance on your alpine setup, you're going to want more lift, especially on the back foot, because in alpine, your fore-aft position is really important. And to have the best athletic position, you kind of want a pretty good fore position, which is not completely aligned over your front foot, but 90% aligned over your front foot. And the further back you are, the more leverage the board has against you. The further forward you are, the more leverage you have against the snowboard. So then the whole plate setup changes the dynamics. So for alpine, it gets quite complex. And on a soft boot setup, the canting helps, again, to be ergonomic, especially if you're looking for a more sturdy stance or a more athletic stance, which is a wider stance. And you could combine actually having a little bit more height to get more leverage, and your cant to get more ergonomics. And also, it all has to do with your height, because if you have longer legs, you're going to want to be further apart. You're going to want to have more cant. If you have short legs, or you consider that you have short legs, then you might not need necessarily those cants. But again, it depends the comfort you're looking for and the ergonomics. A lot of the bindings come pre-canted, and oftentimes they'll have that softer pad. And not only that, the boots, the soft boots, are quite soft, so they do take that position, that ergonomic position. So it's not as important as in hard booting, but it has to do with your comfort. So if you feel like, there's something awkward, I need something, consider just testing it on one foot or the other, like just canting the back foot. You either shim the inside of the binding with EVA foam that cants you, or you could consider one of the trenched cants. I've tried those. They go really well. They're quite simple to set up, and you get both. You get leverage and canting. So there's quite a few options. It just depends, someone that sells you a canting, it's just easy. You set it up. And if you're manual at all, like if you have enough setup, then you can save some pretty pennies by just doing it yourself. Just depends what your situation is. That's about that.
Okay, thanks. Since we're on that subject, I'm just going to show people both here. These are the trenched canted risers. And even though we call them the canted risers, it actually only provides lift because the canting comes inside your boot. These are just some rubber pads I put in the toe of the front foot. You probably can't see that, but it's in the heel of the back foot in this binding. Yeah, poor man's lift kit. Ride Supercarver had another question, if you don't mind. He says, where are you? Where did it go? In the latter stages of your racing career, you had an isolation plate with a mechanism in the middle. What was the design principle, and what was it designed to do?
Yeah. I played around with plates, not just plate. I actually studied plates for well over 20 years. From the first rudimentary plates that unfortunately blew Mark Fawcett out of the '98 Olympics, up to whatever we're using today, like the all-flex plates and those center mount plates is what we call them. There's still types of bridge plates where they bridge one foot to the other. And it's the center mount, the dynamics are really, I'm not going to go through everything because a lot of what I studied, I don't put out there just freely. But what I can explain about a center mount system, which is what I was using at some point in the latter part of my career, was that it allows the board to, it allows the plate to separate from the board and spring back when you exit the turn. And each end of the plate is in some way free floating. So that means both ends end up actually letting the board bend as opposed to one end more than the other and slide. And you have different types of brackets that give you different results. So you can have a center mount in many different ways, like just a straight center mount. Like what I had was a two-piece center mount, or actually it was a four-piece center mount. And the ends, you can have sliding system, pivot systems, swivel systems, pendulum systems. So there's all sorts of bracket settings that actually make all the difference. You have the plate itself that's enormously consequential to the performance, and the bracket system is just as consequential, probably even more important than the plate itself. And then the snowboard has to adapt to that plate system. So what I was working on was more to dampen, because some actually act as spring, others act as dampeners, and others are kind of in between or one end of the spectrum or the other. at the latter part, when I was working on that center mount, it was more to dampen, but it actually killed a lot of the speed. So it worked really well when it was steeper, when it was choppier, which was kind of what I was looking for, because a lot of the World Cups end up being beat up after so many runs when you're doing knockout rounds parallel. But in the end, what gives you the purest speed is something that's quite loose and doesn't dampen as much. If anything, springs you. The danger of having a plate that gives you more spring, like some will have a piston system or actually a spring system in it, is you actually amplify chatter. So as much as it helps you absorb things, it gives you so much kickback that if you do get chatter, it just amplifies it. So there's a lot of dynamics that you have to study and understand, and each plate kind of has its own conditions or pitch or snow condition. So yeah, big question, and you can get a lot more information out of me in a longer answer.
I'm going to keep bugging you. We've got a question here from Demir in Serbia, who is riding one of your C4s right now. He says, if toe and heel drag are not a concern, what are the advantages and disadvantages of using a wider snowboard for carving in a posy-posy stance with higher edge angles?
The disadvantage.
What are the advantages and disadvantages of width? If he says if toe and heel drag are not a concern.
Yeah.
But I think probably there
I see.
there are no advantages to a wider board if you're not dragging your toes or heels.
No, there are.
Oh.
And you're the first example, James.
How's that?
So going wider than what you need is good for soft snow. So if you're carving in, let's say, really slushy conditions or softer conditions, like if it snowed a couple inches or if the groomers are really deep, a wider board just allows you to get that much deeper without drag. But that's the only real positive that I could see of going wider than what you need. So if you're oftentimes in soft conditions, yeah, go a little wider than what you would need. But definitely if it's harder conditions, you never want to go any wider than what you need. You can, it's not the end of the world, but then you're actually fighting the leverage of the board.
And I know I already had my turn, but if I can ask one more question, what the heck is this thing?
Don't worry about that, James.
Is that proprietary technology?
No, it's not at all, but it just shows that I'm a little crazy about stuff.
Let's see it.
It's from my hard boots. I used to ride with this to help lateral leverage.
So that would go on your front foot.
Yeah,
on the
front
side.
foot outside. But I'm
lateral
actually
booster.
trying it in my soft boots and it really works. So it's quite stiff. It's super thin, really light. It's just, I made it out of carbon. It's rudimentary. It looks like hell, but it works amazing. So that's why I don't want to show it. It's just ugly as sin.
Oh, I see. I've never seen something like that before. I'm psyched to try it.
Oh yeah, so James is gonna try my side shim here, my side stiffener.
Wicked.
You'll probably end up with a production run by next year.
Yeah. Give me half a year. I'll get these made in China.